Who could have predicted that a day spent doing what they loved could take such a devastating turn? A group of 10 young and skilled cavers, driven by their passion for exploration, ventured into the depths of the unknown, eager to discover new sections of the Mossdale caverns that had yet to be mapped. However, tragedy struck, and only 4 of them made it back to the surface. Join me as we delve into the devastating events of that fateful day, where excitement turned to terror and lives were forever changed. The Mossdale Caverns is a vast system located in Yorkshire Dales, England, not too far north of Grassington. A caver, named Bob Leakey, began the exploration of the cave in the year 1941. Bob was quite the expert caver, very experienced in his profession. He was so experienced that all of his explorations into the Mossdale cave were solo explorations. The only note he made was that the cave system was extremely prone to flooding, and it would take about 8 to 10 hours to get to the end of the cave. 2 cavers, Mike Boone and Pete Livesley, recently made it to the end of the Mossdale cave system long after Bob Leakey in the year 1964. This renewed the caving community's interest in the Mossdale cave system, leading to more explorations again. A group of cavers, eager to map the unmapped sections of the Mossdale cave system, embarked on their exploration on Saturday, June 24, 1967. Their adventure would lead to a day forever etched in history. The caving team consisted of 10 members split into a group of 6 and another group of 4, with 2 different goals to achieve. The first group of cavers included Jeff, Bill, Michael, John, Colin, and Dave Adamson, who was the leader of the group. Their clear objective was to reach the cave's end and use explosives to break through a long-standing barrier that had halted their progress. The second group included Jim, John, Colette, and Morgan. Their goal was to go in, but only to go as far as the rough chamber, which was about 40 minutes in. After this, they were to return to the surface to wait for the first group. Morgan was the fiancé of the leader, Dave Adamson, and Michael was their youngest member at the age of 17, which is quite impressive. This caving out system was not a tourist cave. It offered very few places where one could stand fully upright, with most areas requiring crawling and squeezing through wet surfaces filled with rocks and mud. Definitely not a place for the claustrophobic. Both teams began the exploration. As planned, the second group, upon reaching the rough chamber, which was just a bit bigger than most closets, turned and headed back, while the first team continued forward into the cave system through the tunnel. This cramped tunnel stretches about 900 feet, roughly the length of 3 football fields, filled with narrow rock and a small stream of water running along the bottom. The Far Marathon passage is so tight that you have to move in one direction only. It's just 18 inches wide and 12 inches high, leaving barely enough space for an average-sized person to drag themselves through. Picture crawling in a space barely larger than your chimney, with your shoulders pressed forward and no room to move your arms or legs. Once you're in, turning around is impossible, and you're committed for at least an hour. There are only 2 ways to turn back. The first lies in finding a larger chamber, like the rough chamber, where they could now change directions, and the second way requires them to crawl backward. Both Initial Marathon and Far Marathon are 900-foot-long crawls, with a small 5-foot area between them where you can briefly stand before continuing. As the men reached the end of Far Marathon, the tunnel became even tighter, requiring a careful squeeze to get through. Their goal was to clear this section to help map out more of the cave system. Around 7:30, Morgan, who was waiting for her fiancé, went to check if the men were finished. She found no sign of them and noticed nothing unusual. She then returned to the camp to continue waiting. Later, by 8:30, Morgan went back to check again. The men still hadn't emerged, and at the same time, a light drizzle began to fall. Nothing too alarming, but noticeable. In the tunnel, the men, about 3 hours into the cave system, were setting up to blast through the obstruction when they noticed the water level rising slightly. They brushed it off, not perceiving it as a threat to their mission or their safety. But around 20 minutes later, the water began to rise rapidly, becoming alarmingly high. As the water surged around them, they realized the danger and decided it was time to abandon their work and exit the tunnel. Dave, who knew the cave system better than anyone, told his team they would be safe. But no amount of experience could help them escape the rushing water that was quickly closing in. What had started as a small stream was now a powerful flood, rapidly filling the narrow passages. The men soon understood that their situation was much worse than they had thought, with every moment making their escape more urgent and dangerous. Morgan returned to the cave entrance once again around 9 p.m. What she saw made her blood run cold. A massive lake of water had collected around the cave system's entrance. She then thought to herself, if the outside was this bad, the cavers must be in deep trouble. Quickly, she snapped out of her trance, deciding it was better to take action than to think. She then raced back to the camp to get help. The men were now moving back up the tunnel by crawling backward. The water in the tunnel was rising to a terrifying level. With no other option, the men had to endure the rising flood and scramble to reach a high chamber as quickly as possible. Each passing second made the walls feel tighter and the water creep closer, amplifying their fear as they fought against the overwhelming rush of water closing in on them. Crawling backward through that long, tight passage was incredibly difficult, but they knew they had to stay calm and follow Dave's lead to escape this nightmare. Michael and Jeff were the first to squeeze through the return path. It was so tight they had to push through with all their strength. After finding a high chamber, they were able to change directions. The water was now crashing into their faces, making moving and breathing even harder. Jeff, familiar with the water flow in Mossdale, believed a swift push through Far Marathon would lead them to safety in the larger chamber above. Meanwhile, the other men were getting their gear ready for their own entry into Far Marathon. As the water flow grew more dangerous, Dave Adamson was sure he knew where to wait out the flood. With urgency driving them, the experienced cavers began their push to escape the rising danger. The flood crashing into Michael's and Jeff's faces was becoming overwhelming. They desperately searched for any crack in the tunnel where they could lift their heads as water poured in. Michael, less experienced, asked Jeff what to do, but even Jeff was at a loss for answers. The water kept pouring in, making it increasingly difficult for Jeff and Michael to breathe. They had found no possible escape and couldn't even locate a crack to breathe through. As they lifted their heads, desperately searching for any tiny pocket of air, the harsh reality set in. There was no escaping this trap. Michael spotted a small crack ahead and, with his body nearly fully submerged, struggled to push through. Breathing was becoming nearly impossible. He wedged himself into the crack, taking his last gasps of air, and clung to a faint hope that the water might suddenly stop rising, allowing him to escape. Colin and Bill were led by Dave to a small compartment, but as the water rose, they all faced the crushing reality of the situation. All they could do was imagine a way out, though hope seemed to be slipping away with every passing second. John, on hearing their shouts, quickly sought a higher, safer spot within the cave system. He found a small chamber elevated above the rising waters. John squeezed himself into the small spot that could barely contain him. At first, the chamber seemed like a refuge, providing some temporary relief from the relentless rise of water. But as the water continued to climb, it eventually filled the chamber, leaving him with no escape. Despite his desperate efforts, the rising flood overwhelmed him, and he tragically drowned. Outside the cave, a massive rescue operation had begun. The entrance was entirely blocked by a lake of water, but there was still hope that the men had found a safe chamber to wait in until the water receded. Hundreds of volunteers sprang into action, constructing barriers and setting up pumps to remove the water from the cave's entrance. This effort aimed to lower the water levels inside and clear the passages for safe movement. After efforts to transport the water away from the entrance, rescuers were able to enter the cave. They hoped the group had found refuge in Rough Chamber, but there was no sign of them when they arrived. The search was halted due to the flow of water causing issues, so they had to put a halt to the rescue operation for a while. At 12:40 p.m., rescuers resumed their search and entered the long passage. Sadly, 5 hours later, at 5:40 p.m. on June 25th, the team discovered the bodies of the 5 cavers in the far part of the West Passage. Though the bodies were identified, John's remains were still missing, leaving a slim ray of hope that he might have survived. By 6 o'clock, the rain had started again, forcing the search for John to be postponed until Monday, June 26th. Contrary to some reports, John was not found the following day. It wasn't until Wednesday, June 28th, that Brian, nearly ready to give up, made a final search. Crawling over the remains, he discovered a pair of boots and a helmet that belonged to John. John had been washed up on rocks, with him being barely recognizable. With this discovery, all 6 bodies were identified, completing the painful search. The coroner announced the deaths as an accident, concluding that the men had drowned, likely overwhelmed by a massive surge of water. The bodies could not be safely removed, leading to the closure of the cave after this tragedy, making it the final resting place of these 6 cavers. 3 years later, friends of these cavers returned to the Far Marathon and buried the bodies in the sanctuary.